Everyone knows how the medieval church got rich. Frightened peasants, a cynical priesthood, 1,000 years of selling salvation to people who couldn't read the contract. It's a clean story. It has villains in it, and villains are satisfying. Here's what it can't explain. The largest landholding interest in England in 1086 had fought no war, made no marriage, and won no conquest to get there. It had simply never once been required to divide anything. The picture most people carry is a picture of extraction. Wealth moving upward, in one direction, under pressure. A great institution reaching down into a village and taking. But when the Domesday Commissioners rode out across England 20 years after the Norman conquest, that is not the shape of what they wrote down. The church's holdings were not a handful of enormous prizes. They were thousands of fragments. 2 hides of arable in one village, a mill on a stream in another, half the rights to a fishery, a strip of woodland, 60 acres, given by a man whose name appears nowhere else in the record. Nobody seized any of that. There is no campaign behind it, no confiscation, no clever acquisition. Every single piece of it walked in through the front door, handed over by someone who wanted to hand it over, usually in quantities too small to be worth recording twice. And once it was inside, something happened to it that did not happen to land anywhere else in Europe. It stopped moving. Here is the reframe, and it is not a story about faith at all. Across medieval Europe, every large landholding family was subject to the same slow machine. A man accumulates land over a lifetime. He dies. The land divides among sons, into a daughter's marriage portion, into a widow's dower, into the hands of whoever won the last dispute. 2 generations later, the estate that took 40 years to build is 4 estates. 3 generations later, some of those pieces have been sold to cover a debt, and one of them belongs to the family that beat them in a war. That is not bad luck. That is the default condition of property when the owner is mortal. The church was the one landholder on the continent that this machine could not touch. A monastery does not die. It does not marry. It has no sons to satisfy and no daughters to endow. When a landowner in 11th century Burgundy handed an abbey a field, that field did not enter a family. It entered an institution with no exit. An abbey has no children. So the arithmetic runs in one direction only. Every gift is permanent. Every permanent gift compounds against a lay landscape that is fragmenting on a generational clock. Nobody has to be clever. Nobody has to be greedy. Nobody has to plan. You only need 2 things: a steady trickle of small donations and time. And the trickle never had to be impressive. That is the part that resists belief. There is no year in which the church acquires a fortune. There is only a very long sequence of years in which it acquires a field, and does not lose the field it acquired the year before. And this is the part that changes how the rest of the period reads. Once you can see the mechanism, once you can see that this is compound accumulation running on real estate inside an immortal owner, a great deal of what you were taught was the character of the Middle Ages stops sounding like character. It starts sounding like consequence. The credulity, the fanaticism, the corruption, all of it has a much duller explanation underneath, and the duller explanation is the true one. Start with a man who is not thinking about any of this. Northern France, sometime in the 11th century. A knight holds enough land to keep himself and a horse, armor, and the men who ride with him. He has 3 sons and a daughter. He is not wealthy in the way we mean the word. He has no coin worth speaking of, but he has acres, and acres are the only real capital anyone has. He dies. The eldest son takes the core of the estate, because in his region that is the custom. The second son gets a smaller holding on the edge, enough to live on and not enough to matter. The third son gets nothing to speak of, which is why so many third sons end up in the church or on a horse heading somewhere violent. The daughter's marriage carries a portion of the land into another family entirely, and it does not come back. And before any of that is settled, the lord above them takes a payment for permitting the inheritance at all, because that is what lords do at the moment of death. They charge for the transfer. 1 estate, 1 death, 4 or 5 pieces, and one of them now flies somebody else's banner. Run that forward. Do it again in 30 years. Do it again in 30 more. Add a bad harvest that forces a sale. Add a lawsuit. Add a rebellion where the family picks wrong and the crown takes the lot. By the 4th generation, the coherent block of land that the knight spent his life holding together exists only as a line in a charter, and the charter is describing something that no longer exists. Now take the strip he gave to the abbey down the valley. He gave it for a reason that made complete sense to him, and that we tend to flatten into superstition. He wanted the monks to pray for him after he died. That was the transaction. Land in one direction, prayer in the other, forever. And it was a transaction. It was written down. A charter is drawn up naming the field. its boundaries, the men who witnessed it, and the specific obligation the house is taking on, usually the date each year on which his name is to be read out. Sometimes he keeps the use of the land for the rest of his life, and the abbey takes it only when he dies. Sometimes his sons sign too, which tells you something about how well everyone understood what was being given up. The parchment goes into the abbey's chest. A copy is entered into a register. That register is the thing to keep your eye on, because it is the only object in this story that never gets lost. Follow that strip through the same 4 generations. There is no death, so there is no division. There is no marriage, so nothing leaves in a dowry. There are no sons to disappoint. There is no inheritance payment to the Lord above, because nobody is inheriting the abbey that held it in 1090 is the same abbey that holds it in 1290. Legally speaking, even though not one man who walked its cloister in 1090 is alive. There is no rebellion to be on the wrong side of, because the institution does not take sides in a way that gets it attainted. And critically, in almost all circumstances, it cannot be sold, because it was given for a purpose, and the purpose does not expire. 4 generations later, the knight's family holds a fraction of what he held. Some of them are farming land they rent from somebody else. The abbey holds a strip the same boundaries, the same acreage, worked by men whose grandfathers had not been born when the charter was sealed, plus the 400 other strips that 400 other men gave for the same reason, each for the same small price. And when a dispute arises over where exactly his field ends, the abbey opens the register, only now name it. This is a portfolio with contributions and no redemptions, held by an owner with an infinite time horizon, sitting inside an economy where every competing owner is being forced to liquidate on a schedule set by human mortality. There is nothing spiritual about that. It is a structural asymmetry, and it ran for 800 years. The first consequences arrive quickly, and none of them require anyone to intend them. Start with the land market itself. Every acre that enters the church is an acre that leaves circulation permanently, not for a generation, permanently. In a society where land is the only meaningful store of wealth, the only collateral, the only way to pay a soldier, and the only way to marry a daughter well, this is a slow drain on the single resource that everything else runs on. It is not felt in any one year. It is felt across 2 centuries, as a steadily thinner pool of available land, chased by families who need it for exactly the same purposes their great-grandfathers did. Then the scale itself. When the Domesday Survey was totaled in 1086, the church's possessions in England came to something on the order of a quarter of the assessed wealth of the country and roughly 26% of its cultivated ground. That figure deserves an immediate caveat, because it is the kind of number that gets repeated without its hedge. It was never uniform. In the counties where ecclesiastical holdings have been studied closely, the share swings from around 15% in Kent to around 28% in Somerset. There is no single medieval church balance sheet, and anyone who hands you one has smoothed over a continent. But the direction is not in doubt. 20 years after a foreign conquest had violently reassigned nearly every lay estate in England, after the entire aristocracy had been replaced, roughly 1 acre and 4 under the plough, answered to a bishop, a cathedral chapter, or an abbot. Think about what that means about the 2 systems. The lay landholding class of England had just been completely destroyed and rebuilt from scratch by a man with an army. The church's holdings went through the same conquest and came out on the other side substantially intact, because there was nobody to dispossess. You cannot disinherit an institution. You can rob it, and William's men did, and you can install your own countrymen as abbots, and he did that too. But the land underneath does not change hands, because it does not belong to a person who can be killed or exiled. It belongs to a house. The second-order effects follow from the first. If you are the only entity in a region that holds land continuously across centuries, you become, without trying, several other things at once. You become the largest creditor. Everyone else in the landscape has cash crises tied to deaths, wars, ransoms, and bad harvests. You have a stable, diversified, geographically spread revenue base. So when a lord needs money urgently, there is exactly one institution nearby, with reserves and no urgent need for them. Land gets pledged. Sometimes it gets pledged and never redeemed. You become the biggest employer of specialists, the men who can read, write, draft a contract, keep an account, survey a boundary. Not because of a monopoly on intelligence, but because you are the only organization whose planning horizon is long enough to make training a specialist worthwhile. And you become the memory. A family remembers its rights, as long as somebody living remembers them. A monastery writes them down, keeps the parchment, copies it into a register, and produces it in court 300 years later. In a dispute over a boundary between a lay family and an abbey in 13th century England, one side is arguing from what people recall, and the other is arguing from a document. That is not a fair fight, and it was not designed as one. It is a side effect of being the only party in the room that expects to still be in the room in the year 1400. Now the more interesting layer, because an institution that cannot die creates problems that nobody had needed to solve before, and the solutions it built are still standing. Take the tithe first, because it is the piece everyone thinks they understand. A tithe is a tenth of agricultural output. What matters is not the rate it is, where the collection happens. In the field, at the harvest, in kind, before the produce goes anywhere or becomes anything. It does not care who won the last war, or whether the local lord is solvent, exiled, or 9 years old. It arrives from the physical fact of a crop coming out of the ground, and crops come out of the ground regardless of politics. It did not begin as law. The church had urged it as a duty, long before anyone was compelled. The change came in 779, when Charlemagne issued a capitulary at Herstal, putting the weight of secular authority behind it, the first legal obligation to pay tithes imposed by a ruler with the machinery to enforce it. A moral expectation becomes a collection system, and not because a churchman demanded it, but because a king found it useful to his own project. Then, watch what gets built on top. In England from the 13th century, monasteries increasingly appropriated parish churches, becoming the rector and taking the revenues. The tithes split. Great tithes, on corn and hay and wood, went to the rector. Small tithes, on garden produce and the awkward things that are difficult to count, stayed local. And since the rector was now an abbey 20 miles away that could not stand at an altar, bishops fought to establish a rule. The appropriating house had to fund a vicar out of the lesser revenues to actually serve the parish. Look at the shape of that. The bulk, reliable, easily measured revenue flows upward to the institution. The labor-intensive, low-value work stays local and is paid for out of what's left. Nobody designed that from a theory. It emerged because one party was permanent and the other was a man who would be dead in 30 years. The evidence is still standing. The tithe barn at Great Coxwell in Oxfordshire, built around 1300 by the monks of Beaulieu, is cathedral-sized, and its only function was to hold grain that other men had grown. The wagons that filled it belonged to people who would never own it. Second, the paid intercession. The doctrine of purgatory takes its developed form relatively late. Jacques Le Goff argued that the noun itself and the articulated doctrine crystallized in the Latin West only in the late 12th century, and his sharp dating has been argued with ever since, by scholars who point to far older ideas about prayer for the dead and think he drew the line too hard. That argument is live, and this is not the place to pretend it is settled. The institutional consequence is not in dispute. From the 13th century, demand for masses said on behalf of the dead outran what existing monastic communities could absorb. So a new instrument appeared, the chantry. You endow it with land or rent. In exchange, a priest says Mass for your soul, at a named altar, in perpetuity. Consider that from the institution's side. The cost of saying a Mass that is already being said, in a chapel that already exists, by a priest already on the premises, is close to nothing. And the customer base does not saturate, because the customer base is everyone who has ever loved somebody who died. Recurring revenue, marginal cost approaching zero, and a demand curve refreshed by human mortality itself. Worth naming precisely because it sounds so modern. Third, and this is the one that outlived everything else, the legal person. There was a genuine technical problem underneath all of this. Monks took vows of poverty. They could not own property. But the monastery obviously did own property, vast amounts of it. Who, precisely, was the owner? The answer came from canon law. Pope Innocent IV, in the mid-13th century, worked out in his commentary on the Decretals the idea of the corporation as a persona ficta, a fictitious person, not a metaphor, a legal entity, distinct from every human being inside it, capable of holding property in its own right, entering obligations, and persisting while its members died and were replaced. They did not build that to get rich. They built it because they needed an owner for assets that no living member was permitted to own. But the thing they built is the immortal legal person, and every corporation on earth is a descendant of it. The counterfactual is where a constraint stops being a curiosity and turns into a price. The most obvious casualty is the land market itself. In an economy where land is the productive asset, the ability to reallocate it matters enormously, to move it toward whoever can farm it best, drain it, invest in it, or simply use it rather than sit on it. A functioning market does that continuously through sale. Church land could not be sold. Not easily, not routinely, and in many cases, not at all. It had been given for a purpose for the soul of a named person, under conditions written into a charter, and alienating it meant breaking a trust with someone who was dead and could not release you from it. Canon law made disposal of ecclesiastical property difficult by design, so the largest single block of land in Western Europe sat almost entirely outside the mechanism by which land finds its most productive holder. Note what that does to the institution's own discipline. A lay family holding an estate that performs badly eventually feels its debts come due. Land gets sold, the market corrects them painfully. An abbey with a badly run manor has no such event. No creditor who can force a sale, no heir demanding a share, no moment of reckoning at all. Bad management does not get punished. It gets carried, sometimes for 200 years. The absence of a liquidity event is a shield, and a shield is also a way of never finding out you are wrong. Second thing that could never happen, recovery. A family in 14th century England that had fallen on hard times could buy back land it had sold to another family. That happens constantly. The land market is full of families clawing their way back, but a strip an ancestor had given to a priory in 1150 was gone in a way that ordinary loss is not. There was no counterparty to negotiate with, because there was no one whose interest it was to sell. An abbey has no children, which also means it has no heir who might need the cash, no widow who might prefer coin, no younger son who wants out. There is nobody on the other side of the table. Third, taxation. And this is the one that eventually broke the whole arrangement. The emerging states of the 12th and 13th centuries were built on a specific problem. How does a king raise money regularly and predictably, rather than by extracting one-off payments from crises? Their answer was to tax landholding, and the mechanisms available to them were mostly tied to human events. You charge when a tenant dies and his heir takes over. You take the revenues when an heir is underage. You take the land back when a line dies out entirely. Every one of those levers requires somebody to die. Land held by the church generated none of them, ever. Not once. It was, from the crown's point of view, land that had gone permanently dark, still productive, still generating wealth, and structurally invisible to the entire apparatus of royal finance. And it was not a small proportion. It was a quarter of the country, so the counterfactual is not a minor one. Across several centuries, a substantial fraction of the wealth of Western Europe sat outside the land market, outside the credit market's discipline, and outside the fiscal reach of the states that were trying to build themselves. Every serious project of the period, the professional army, the salaried administration, the state that could plan beyond a single reign, was being attempted with one hand tied, and the knot had been tied by ordinary people giving away small fields, one at a time, for reasons that had nothing to do with any of it. So go back to the accusations, and hand each of them back. Credulity first. The odds went through medieval people were dupes, handing over land because they'd been frightened into it by men in robes. Look at what the donor was actually buying. Land, in his world, was the only thing that lasted. He was exchanging the durable asset he had for a durable service he wanted, from the only institution in existence that could credibly promise to still be performing it in 200 years. Nobody else could make that promise. The crown could not. His own family could not. His own family would be in pieces by then, and he knew it, because he had watched it happen to his neighbors. He was not being naive. He was making the only long-dated contract available to a man in the 11th century, with the only counterparty capable of honoring one. Fanaticism next. The mass endowments, the pilgrimage, the sheer volume of resource pointed at the invisible world. That reads as a society gripped by something irrational, until you notice that this was also the only social technology that reached past a lifetime. If you wanted anything at all to survive you, a name, an act, a memory, a hospital, a school, the institution with no death date was the only vehicle that existed. What looks like religious excess is also the entire available toolkit for doing anything permanent. Corruption third, and this is the one people are most attached to. The image of the fat abbot, the grasping bishop, the whole edifice as a racket. The trouble is that the accumulation mechanism does not need a single corrupt man to run. It runs on absence, the absence of heirs, of divisions, of dowries, of forced sales. Every individual inside it could be sincere, austere, and personally penniless, and the balance sheet would still grow at exactly the same rate. Corruption existed, and contemporaries said so loudly, and the reform movements that erupted repeatedly across the period were mostly led from inside the church by people who could see it. But corruption is not the engine. The engine is arithmetic, and arithmetic does not require a motive. And backwardness, the sense that this was a stagnant world that could not build institutions. That one is simply upside down. This constraint produced the written land record, professional estate accounting, long horizon capital management, and the legal fiction of the immortal person. The Middle Ages did not fail to invent the corporation. It invented the corporation and then put it in a habit. Now the necessary correction, because the version of this argument without it is worse than useless. The constraint decided what was possible. It did not decide what anyone did inside that space. Nothing about non-divisible landholding required a monastery to run a hospital, to feed the poor at its gate, to copy manuscripts, to drain a fen, or to take in the sick. Nothing required the reformers who spent their lives trying to force the institution back toward its own rules. The structure explains why the resources accumulated. It does not explain what any particular house chose to do with them. And houses chose very differently, some magnificently, some disgracefully, most somewhere in between. A model that predicts everything about 1,000 years of human behavior is not a good model. It is a lazy one. An abbey has no children, which is why nothing inside it could ever end the arrangement. No death, no division, no bankruptcy, no heir. If it was ever going to stop, it was going to have to be stopped from outside. The unlocking took about 250 years, and it started with a law against generosity. In 1279, Edward I enacted the Statute of Mortmain. It forbade the granting of land to the church without royal license, on pain of forfeiture. The reasoning was not theological, and nobody pretended it was. Land held in perpetuity by an institution that never died produced no inheritance payments, no wardships, no reversions, none of the events that royal and baronial revenue depended on. The crown and the aristocracy had converging interests here for once, and both had spent 2 centuries watching the tax base walk out of the door, one field at a time. It slowed the flow. It did not stop it. What it mostly did was convert a prohibition into a permission system, with the king holding the gate, and historians who have worked through the license records describe a steady traffic through it across the following 2 centuries. The constraint had been noticed. It had not been solved. The solution, when it came, was blunt. By 1535, when Henry VIII's commissioners compiled the Valor ecclesiasticus, the monastic houses of England were returning something in the order of £130,000 a year, roughly twice what the crown drew from its own estates. Monasteries held around a quarter of the nation's landed wealth and controlled about 2/5 of all parish benefices. The figures vary by method, and the whole church totals cited elsewhere run considerably higher, so treat the precision loosely. The proportion is the point. The king was, on his own land, half the size of the monks. What followed between 1536 and 1541 was the fastest transfer of property in English history. More than 800 religious houses across England, Wales, and Ireland were suppressed. Around 12,000 men and women, roughly 4,000 monks, 3,000 canons, 3,000 friars, 2,000 nuns were turned out. By 1540, houses were being dismantled at about 50 a month, and the crown did not keep it. By Henry's death in 1547, close to 2/3 of the former monastic land had already been granted or sold away, most of it to the same landholding families who had been donating land in the other direction for 400 years. The Chantries Act of that same year finished the job on the other revenue stream, suppressing 2,374 chantries and guild chapels, and seizing their assets 2,374 endowments, where someone was still being prayed for, generations after anyone had known them. This is the point where the tone has to change, because the ledger has a second column. Those houses were not only landlords. They ran almshouses, infirmaries, schools. They distributed food at the gate. How much is genuinely disputed among historians? The early estimate from Alexander Savine put monastic almsgiving at around 2.5% of income, while later work by Neil Rushton, going through the administrative records of Westminster Abbey and Norwich Cathedral Priory, puts it above 7% on the eve of the dissolution. That is a real argument, still live, and the honest answer is that we do not know the number. What is not disputed is that thousands of people who had been fed, housed, or treated by these institutions were not fed, housed, or treated by anything else afterward, and that England spent the following 70 years legislating its way toward a replacement it had not planned for. Nobody in this became kinder or crueler. A king needed money. A number changed. The structure has a modern name, and naming it is useful as long as the comparison is held honestly. What the church operated was permanent capital, an asset base with recurring inflows, a product carrying almost no marginal cost, an infinite time horizon, and the decisive feature, no liquidity event. No moment at which the entity is forced to sell in order to pay someone. Every private fortune in medieval Europe faced a forced sale event roughly every 30 years, and it was called a funeral. Describe an institution today with recurring revenue, near zero marginal cost on its core product, and no structural event that ever compels it to liquidate, and you are not describing a healthy company. You are describing something closer to a sovereign. Now the place the comparison breaks, because an analogy that will not state its own limits is a party trick. Modern permanent capital is permanent by choice. An endowment has trustees, and trustees can vote to spend it down. It marks to market, which means it finds out what it is worth and can be told it has failed. It can be taxed by a legislature that changes the rules on a Tuesday. It answers to living beneficiaries who can sue. The medieval version had none of that. Its beneficiaries were dead. Its trustees were bound by the stated intentions of donors who could not be consulted and could not release them. It had no market price because nothing comparable ever traded. And it could not spend itself down even if a given generation had wanted to, because the thing it had promised was perpetual, and perpetual means what it says. That is not a stronger version of a modern endowment. It is a different object. And it is why the only thing that ever ended it was not a market and not a bad year. It was a state, with an army, deciding that a category of property would stop existing. There is a version of this story where the Middle Ages is 1,000 years of people being fooled, and it is a comfortable story because it lets us feel that we would have known better. The truer version is duller and harder to dismiss. People gave away small pieces of land for reasons that were entirely rational inside their world, to buy the one durable thing that was for sale, from the one counterparty that could still be there to deliver it. The institution receiving those gifts did not need a strategy. It needed a rule, and the rule was that nothing left. Individual monks were poor. Individual houses were often badly run. Individual abbots were sometimes exactly the men their critics said they were. None of it mattered to the total, because the total was not being driven by anybody's character. It was being driven by the absence of an exit. The church was not rich because it collected so much. It was rich because for 1,000 years, it never once had to divide anything. That is the price of an owner that cannot die. Next time, the price of moving a thing that eats. Why a wagon of grain in 12th century Europe could travel only so far before the oxen pulling it had consumed the entire cargo, and how that single number decided which cities could exist, which famines could not be relieved, and which good ideas died on the road before they ever arrived.